So good evening, everybody. I'm Sally Shuttleworth, and I run the Diseases of Modern Life project, which is bringing you the research this evening. I hope you're enjoying the picture of the Riviera before it was spoilt. Now, we're used in current times to people going abroad for a week, possibly at Christmas. You break up the winter, get a bit of sun. But did you know that the Victorians, when they were feeling overstressed, were often recommended by their doctors to go to the Riviera for 6 months to recover their nerves and their strength? And indeed, possibly 6 months once a year was not enough, and maybe 3 years might be required before your nerves and your energies could be restored. I'm going to focus in this talk on two health resorts that developed in the mid-19th century, Menton in the Riviera and Davos in Switzerland. So I take my title from a comment that was made in a periodical in 1874. Health-seeking in our generation is rapidly assuming the character of a recognised cult. So what was he referring to? Winter and Spring on the Shores of the Mediterranean by James Henry Bennet. And he complained that Bennet's siren-like persuasiveness is luring the nation to follow him down to Menton, to the sun-kissed waves of the Mediterranean. Now, the tale behind this is that James Henry Bennet was himself, or so he believed, a sufferer from consumption. He published this book starting in 1861 and then republishing it, and it grew bigger and bigger, talking about all the possible resorts you could go to. But he says that when he went to Menton, miraculously he recovered. And so every time he published the book, he'd repeat this story, and then every spring he'd go off to another resort, sample it, and nowhere was like Menton. What happens then is that Menton grows from a tiny little fishing village to the place to go if you're an invalid on the Riviera. So this is Menton in all its glory. What Bennet also did was create a wonderful garden. And if you can see the tower on the left, or here, he actually turned this into a magnificent garden. So all the tourists also went there, including Queen Victoria, which he managed to get into every single newspaper. He was an absolutely amazing publicist. He's known as the founder of Menton. Here we are. In the Rue Henri Bennet in Menton. I do think they should have a bit more for him than simply a bust, but there we are. So he was an extraordinarily well-known figure. He used to wander around always in an Inverness cape, because he said you could never trust the weather, even if you were on the Riviera. And so he instructed all his patients to similarly look after themselves. So who came to the Riviera and to Menton? Definitely the middle-aged, overworked man. He insisted that the reason he was ill is that he'd overworked. 25 years of being a physician, and his energies were all depleted. And then a whole series of books were published by professional working men talking about how they'd exhausted their energies. And what it did was turn the idea of being an invalid and having no energy into something that was eminently respectable. Bennet talks about legitimate idleness, which I think is a wonderful phrase. And so all these upstanding workaholics suddenly were reborn when they went to Menton, and this amazingly ecstatic descriptions of what it was like moving to this paradise where the sun always shone, the flowers and the blossom, and the wonderful excursions you could go on. So there were middle-aged men, but there were also young men and women suffering from consumption or nervous disorders, and also, quite sadly, children as well. So the visitors just flooded in. Many very well known. Robert Louis Stevenson was there, later Catherine Mansfield in the early 20th century, Queen Victoria, as I've suggested, but also, very interestingly, clergymen. Because one thing it was decided you could suffer from in the mid-19th century, and it's still in the diagnosis books, is clergyman's throat. which was from preaching too many sermons. Now, as you might imagine, there was a bit of scepticism in the press as to whether really this could be a thing. But one of the visitors was a charismatic Baptist preacher called Charles Spurgeon, who used to fill out, he lectured in music halls and racecourse. He built the Metropolitan Tabernacle, which held 6,000 people. But he came for 22 years every winter, most of the winter, to Menton. But here is a picture just to show the Menton group that these were serious people, not frivolously messing their time around, but actually doing what they ought to do whilst they were in Menton, being very serious and religious. So what was the treatment these people had? In many of the spas across Europe, you could go and you could have the grape treatment or the whey treatment, all the sorts of things we have now, the absurd health cures. But in Menton, what Bennett pioneered was a magnificent treatment which consisted of fresh air, sunshine, and exercise. And I think most people recovered because they were encouraged to spend their entire day outside, going on walks by the sea or up into the mountains. So it pioneered really this whole new notion of how to cure, which was without medicine. But of course it also had a sad side. If you visit Menton, which I highly recommend, though it's not quite as I anticipated, having read all the guidebooks from the Victorian era, but it's still very wonderful. But it has a beautiful old town, and then on the top of it, it's crowned with a huge cemetery. So here are some of the graves. This I love. So John Richard Green, the historian of the English people. You see, he died learning. That's what we should have on all our graves. Then more sadly, a 12-year-old girl. And then I include this one, just because I'm very proud of the photograph. You see how atmospheric it is. In addition to all this, there was merchandising. Bennett insisted that what people should do is follow the path of the swallow. You saw the swallow on his book. And the shop started to be full of merchandise with the swallow on. Here, thanks to eBay, you can see a 19th century necklace thing, Je viendrai. This was on everything. I'm in the process maybe of purchasing a Menton shoehorn from 19th century. The people who went there also tried, just like the British today, to replicate their own culture. So here, in Christmas spirit, here we are, buying a Christmas tree in Menton. And you also get the same sort of behaviour as you have now when the standard complaint about the Germans getting all the sunbeds. In Menton in the 19th century, it was the fact that they all took second helpings at the table d'hôte. And another comment was that Menton would be perfect if only we could introduce good English houses with appropriate carpets, coal and fire grates. So I turn now to Davos, which followed very much the same pattern. Tiny little village. Two physicians went there with consumption and appeared to be cured by staying there over winter. And suddenly there was a transformation. Instead of people going down to the Riviera, they started to go to the cold. People had been to Switzerland before and it was a playground of Europe for tourists in the summer. But the notion that you'd actually physically go there in the winter was most unusual. So this is Davos in 1877. You're probably familiar with it from the economic summits now, but this is what it looked like. A slight exaggeration in 1877. And this is the resort's most celebrated invalid, John Addington Symonds, who was an aesthetic writer in the 19th century. As one commentator said, we used to treat invalids as if they were plants in hothouses. But now we refrigerate them. And so there's this tug between Bennett down in Menton and the people developing Davos, which quickly developed. So here you can see the coming of the railway, Hotel Boyle that Symonds actually helped develop. They paid huge attention to the climate. So in all these resorts, you can see the extraordinary attention, so they could all boast who'd got the driest climate, the most sun, etc. So what did the inhabitants do while they were there? Interestingly, up until the 1880s, when they discovered that tuberculosis was actually catching and there was a bacillus behind it, the well and the unwell just lived all together in hotels. And what did they do? Here is the Davos Courier. They had, you probably can't read it, but they had skating parties, tobogganing, and also lectures by Conan Doyle, who was there for 3 years whilst his wife was being treated. But they also, so fancy dresses. I think this is a wonderful suggestion of what life was like. So you've got fancy dresses at the top, you've got skates that you can hire, and then you've got airtight and waterproof coffins. So a rather edgy combination, I'm afraid. But this is what the invalids got up to, tobogganing. And Symonds introduced tobogganing to Davos, and then from there it spread right across Europe. So you can see this was a local artist capturing them. They also did tailing, which I think is magnificent. You have the sleigh horse drawn, and then everybody ties their toboggans behind, and they all went off on tailing parties. Now, here is Symonds. Now, you don't normally expect to see an aesthete on a toboggan, but here you are. And he also wrote an article about it, and here he's transformed himself, I think wonderfully, into maybe a slightly alarmed tobogganist. So this was a period before the growth of sanatoria. You're probably used to all those images of invalids out on balconies. These were developed round about 1900. So should you wish to go to Davos, this is a current photo from my holidays, or my research trip, I should say. The Schatzalp, where it's absolutely unchanged. All the plumbing, everything is as it was in 1901. So it's magnificent. And I'll just show you the rewards of a research life. This was my bedroom, but you can see I was working. But just look at the view, and you can see why the invalids probably got better. So thank you, and I will stay around if anybody wants to come up and ask questions afterwards. But also, if you would fill out both the postcards for the evening and also the sheet on talks, it'd be really helpful for us to get some feedback. So thank you.